Hi, I'm Sarah. I grew up Amish in Pennsylvania, and I'm an ex-Amish woman now. And today, I want to answer a question I get more than you'd think, especially from people who assume Amish life is just horses, buggies, and bonnets. People ask me all the time, what about condoms? Are they allowed? And I want to be careful how I say this because Amish communities aren't all identical. There isn't one single Amish rule book that applies the exact same way everywhere. But in the community I came from, using condoms was not allowed. It was seen as wrong. And the truth is, when I was Amish, I didn't sit around thinking about condoms. It just wasn't a topic you talked about. Sex in general wasn't talked about openly. You learned what you needed to learn in a very limited way, and you were expected to live within the rules without needing every detail explained. So I didn't really think about it until later, after I had already started leaving that world behind. A long time ago, I went back to visit my Amish family, and I remember this moment so clearly because it caught me completely off guard. I was at my brother's house just visiting like normal. People were in the kitchen, kids were moving around. There was that familiar noise of a full house. And at one point, my sister-in-law pulled me aside, like not in a dramatic way, but in that quiet, serious way where you can tell someone has been holding something in. And she looked so stressed, like she was carrying this heavy secret. She said something like, "Sarah, we've been using condoms and we're sinning." And I remember just blinking at her because I genuinely didn't know what she meant at first. I was like, "What?" And she repeated it. "We've been using condoms and I feel so guilty because we're sinning." The way she said it wasn't casual. It wasn't like she was debating a rule. It was like she was confessing something she thought could really count against her, spiritually, like it was a real moral failure. And I asked her, how is it sinning? Because in my head, I was thinking about health, about finances, about how hard pregnancy can be on a woman's body, about how hard it is to raise a family when you're already exhausted. I was thinking in practical terms. But she wasn't. She said, "If we're doing it and I get pregnant, that's God's will. And because we've been using condoms, we've been going against God's will." That was her whole reasoning. Very simple, very direct. If a pregnancy happens, it's meant to happen. Preventing it on purpose means you're interfering. And that's where the sin comes in, at least in the way she had been taught. And she wasn't saying it like she was proud of it or trying to be rebellious. She looked scared, like she was waiting for punishment or waiting for God to be angry or waiting for someone to find out. She said, "I feel so guilty." And I didn't know what to say. I honestly didn't. Because at that time in my life, I was young and rebellious, and I was already living very differently. I was on birth control. I was using condoms. And to me, it wasn't a moral crisis. It was just normal adult life. So I said the first thing that popped into my head, which was probably not the best thing to say, but it was my honest reaction in that moment. I said, "At least you didn't get pregnant." And she immediately shook her head, like that didn't solve anything at all. She was like, "Yeah, but we're still sinning." Like for her, the guilt wasn't tied to consequences. It wasn't, "Oh no, now we have another baby when we can't handle it." It was, "Oh no, we did something that's wrong in God's eyes." And she said again, "I feel really bad." And I just stood there, kind of frozen, because I knew how serious she was. But I also knew that if I answered too honestly, I might make it worse. I didn't want to sound like I was judging her, and I didn't want to sound like I was encouraging her, and I didn't want to disrespect her beliefs because those beliefs were still her whole world, so I just kind of listened, and I think I said something like, "I'm sorry you're feeling that way." Something gentle, something safe, but inside, it hit me hard because it showed me something people on the outside don't always understand. When you grow up Amish, a lot of the rules aren't just rules. They're tied to salvation. They're tied to your standing with God. They're tied to your community, your reputation, your family, your future. You don't just break a rule and move on. You carry it. And looking back now, I can see where she was coming from more than I could in that moment. Because from the outside, people might hear that and think, why would a married couple feel guilty for using protection? But from inside that world, the expectation is often that children come when they come. You don't plan it in the same way. You don't control it in the same way. And if you do, it can feel like you're choosing yourself over what you've been taught is obedience. And I also want to say this because it matters. In Amish life, women carry a lot of the weight of this. Pregnancy after pregnancy, postpartum after postpartum, the physical toll, the mental toll, the constant work, the constant responsibility. And yet, the conversation about choices, spacing, or prevention is not something that's openly supported in many communities. So when my sister-in-law told me she felt guilty, what I really heard was a woman who was tired, who was trying to manage her life the best way she knew how, and who was terrified that even trying to protect her own body and her own limits might make her a bad person. And that moment stayed with me. Because it wasn't about condoms, really. It was about fear and control and how deeply beliefs can shape your choices, even when no one is physically forcing you. It was about how guilt can live in your chest like a constant pressure, because you've been taught that God is watching every decision, even the private ones. So to answer the question in a real way, from my experience, in the community I came from, condoms were not allowed. They were seen as interfering with God's will, and even talking about it carried shame. And if you've never lived inside a world like that, it can sound extreme. But if you have, you know it can feel completely normal. And I know this topic is sensitive. I'm not here to attack anyone's faith. I'm just telling you what I lived, what I saw, and what I heard with my own ears in my own family. If you want, I can also talk about what dating and marriage education is like in Amish communities and why so many women feel unprepared to even have these conversations in the first place.